Have you thought about buying acreage property in the Portland metro area? Well, you're in luck because today's video, we're going to talk about the top 8 things that you're going to need to know before you buy acreage property. And we're getting after it right now. If this is your first time to the channel and you want to know everything there's possibly could be to know about living in the greater Portland metro area, then make sure that you click that subscribe button and tap that notification bell so that you can be the first to know. I'm Ann Stewart. This is Erica Hagfirst. We are your go-to gals if you're making that move to the Portland metro area. All of our contact information is in that description below, so we can text with you, call you, we can hop on a Zoom. Let's get to know each other and find out what your goals are to make your move to Portland so smooth. All right, we're sitting out in acreage property. We thought so how nice. Appropriate for us to do a video all about the things you're gonna need to know before buying acreage property here in Oregon. And we're sitting in a field in Acreage. It's a beautiful day here in Oregon. So yeah, what's the first topic we're gonna talk about, Erica?
So I think one that's not super sexy to talk about is gonna be zoning and what can you actually do with the land. So often we just assume that you can buy a parcel of land.
Do whatever you want with it.
And do whatever you want. Throw a manufactured home on it, or, build a barn or do any of these other things and, run your business out of it. And that's just not the case in Oregon. So you really have to look at what is the land zoned for? Is it just farming? Is it just agriculture? Is it industrial?
Can you put more than one building on the property?
Right, and so really having an understanding of what you're able to do with that piece of property, and does it have a building site? Can you actually build on it? There is recreation only land where you cannot build on that property.
Or you can't build, if you have a house on it, they sometimes don't let you put more than one outbuilding on the property.
Yeah, so if you are somebody who's planning to come in and there's already some outbuildings, or maybe you want to add an ADU, you really need to do some due diligence up front, and your agent's going to work with you on that as well, but you got to hear it from the horse's mouth. And so you're going to have a really good relationship with the county to figure out, what can you do? Are there any overlays that go, with your property that are going to determine what you can do with it, where you can build on it? And, because once you start adding overlays and zoning issues to a property, it can get real tiny real quick. So just making sure that you have a really clear understanding of what you can do with that property. Can you run a business out of it? Are you looking to start, a boarding business, or are you looking to, do a farm store for chicken or cattle or any of those things? Just make sure that you truly understand what is your zoning, what can you do with it, and
And usually we're writing in a contingency and an offer for that kind of property to make sure you have the time to do your due diligence. It's almost like an inspection of what you can do with the property. So sometimes it can be up to 30, 60 days depending on what your goal is. And so just understand, if you're going to be buying acreage property, make sure your contingency allows you enough time to get the information from the county, or sometimes you have to get further information to get to the county in order for them to say, okay, we would let you do that, or no, we wouldn't. So,
and some of this is a little bit more indicative of buying bare land, but even with properties that have structures on them, a house and a barn, or a house and shop, you really do want to understand if you're going to use it more for just your residential use. You need to really make sure that you understand what you can do with that property, because all it takes is one neighbor who's like, hey, you're not technically supposed to do that you've upset, and you could be in a world of hurt because you've now bought a property that you can't do what you want to do with it.
Okay, number 2 is water. If you don't have public water, which a lot of acreage properties don't have access to public water, some do, some random ones have access to a local public water system, then you're gonna need to put a well in. If it does have a well, then you will wanna test the well water. By law, the seller is required to do 3 bacteria tests on the water to make sure it is drinkable, potable, etc. And as a buyer, you can elect to do any other testing on the well water, and we always recommend doing a flow test. And a flow test in Oregon, you want to make sure that you have a minimum of 6 gallons per minute or more on your well, because less than that is not enough flow to technically have
consistency in your water. So those are the tests you do on a existing well. Now, if you don't have a well on the property and one needs to go in, what do you got to do, Erica?
You got to get some people out there to look at your land, see what's going on in the area, you know, determine that you have a water table that's viable in that area. You know, the other thing to think about is if you're, you know, in a valley, okay, that might not be as significant a cost to put a well in. But if you're up on top of a hill and you got to drill down to the bottom of that hill to get to your water source, it can get real spendy real fast, you know. So, I mean, wells can typically range from, you know, $15,000 to $20,000 all the way up to $100,000, depending on what you need to put in and how deep you need to drill. You know, going back to flow and how much water you have, you know, there's things that you can do to work with low water flow sources, holding tanks, but really having an understanding, again, of how much water your land's producing is going to be super important to, you know, being able to run a household.
Now let's talk about shared wells for a minute, because that's actually pretty common, and it's not uncommon. A lot of times people do have a shared well, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so with a shared well, generally it's one or more homes that are, you know, sharing that well. They're all pulling water from it. So again, super important that you make sure that that well has enough flow that it can support however many households are drawing from that one well. And then on top of that, you know, you're gonna wanna make sure that there's some sort of agreement in place between those other homeowners or, you know, lots that dictates how and what happens if something goes wrong with the well. You know, if you, and this happens, you know, you wake up after a storm, a hard freeze, something happens, you turn that water on and there's nothing that comes out, that's on you to fix. You know, you have to get somebody out there who can look at your well, see what's going on. You know, is there a leak somewhere? Did your motor go out? You know, all of those kind of things. And so understanding, you know, what that looks like and who's gonna pay for what, super important, because it can get expensive.
All right, now you're gonna need sewage, and typically on acreage properties, almost always you're gonna have a septic system. Now, depending on if you're buying raw land or existing properties that have, you know, structures and houses on it, you wanna make sure that that septic system is working properly. So during your inspection period, you're gonna be doing a septic inspection of the actual tank. And more importantly, you're going to want to check the drain fields, because oftentimes think it's just the tank, but no, in fact, you want to make sure the drain fields are working properly and the distribution boxes are working. Oftentimes those get run over, clogged, broken. The other thing that's really important to do in a septic inspection, and a lot of people don't do this, but is to scope the line from the house to the tank, because that oftentimes shows a little problem. It's like a sewer scope for your septic tank. But those are all really important to do. Now, your septic tank, if you're planning on building on a property, you want to make sure you're putting a big enough septic tank in the property to handle the number of bedrooms you're planning on doing. And more importantly, if you buy raw land, you're going to want to do, well, we used to call them a perk test. They don't really call them that anymore. They just dig some some holes in the ground, and then they see how the water table works, because that'll determine if you're going to do a gravity-fed septic or if you're going to need a sand filtration system.
Yeah, and this is where lay of the land and where your build site is are going to come into play. These things are all kind of interconnected, but you know, making sure that your septic system, if there is an existing one, is in good working order, because if it's not, the other thing, depending on how big the size of your acreage is, but you need to have a replacement site for your septic system. You know, and gravity fed are obviously less expensive to put in than a sand filtration, which can be in the range of, you know, $40,000. So significant difference when, you know, gravity is sometimes sitting around the range of, you know, 20,000 plus. So things to think about as you're, you know, establishing your property, where you're going to be, where the house site is, all of those things. You know, and then the other thing that you want to think about is you don't want your drain field somewhere, you know, if you have animals, you don't want it in a pasture, you don't want it in a roadway, you don't want to put gravel or concrete over any of those you know, lines. And, you know, like Ann said, your septic system is going to be, the size of your tank is going to be determined off the number of bedrooms. It doesn't matter how much square footage you have or how many bathrooms, it's number of bedrooms. You know, and so I think it's almost standard these days to use a concrete tank, but that's kind of top of the line. You'll see in some of these home inspections, as we go through older sites, they've had plastic in the past, metal, and those things usually are at the end of their life if they're still in the ground. And then, looking at what repair costs are and stuff like that. So leaving your system accessible is also very important. Oftentimes we find when we have established homes that, you're digging down 6 feet to get to your septic tank, or, nobody knows where it's at. So all things to think about. And then just, if you're buying the bare land, making sure that you're testing the land. Sometimes you'll see on listings where they say they've already gotten septic approval.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's in. That just means that the property has been approved. They've looked at it. They've gone through that step of preparing the land to be built on.
All right, so next up is kind of a unique one. It's the lay of the land and usability. So oftentimes, you're looking at land for sale and you're like, wow, there's 40 acres and it's super cheap. And that's because that 40 acres probably really isn't 40 acres. It's probably like up a hillside, or
not as usable as you think.
No, or super steep, or you've heavily forested. And this is where, you really have to take a hard look at, like, what is it that you plan to do with the land? Are you hoping to have pasture? And are you hoping to have that soon? Because, clearing land and getting it to grow grass or be ready for animals, that's easily a year plus in the making to clear, and then reseed and let the land settle. If you also don't want to have your animals just walking up straight hills and stuff like that, if you're looking to farm, again, having something that's super, super hilly, unless you're maybe growing grapes, isn't going to be super desirable, and you pay for that desirability. So the more usable the land, the more expensive it gets. Something else I think about as somebody with horses and animals is that, like, when I buy a piece of property, while I want usability, I also want some built-in shade. So I like having some trees on my property, because that way my animals have shade during these hot summer months, and I'm not necessarily having to build structures to put out there. You also think just about how is water going to affect your land as you go through the rainy season. Because it doesn't really take much. You don't have to be near a body of water. You don't have to, if you're too flat, you can almost hold water because it has nowhere to drain. And too hilly, it's going to drain somewhere, but where is it going to land at the end of it? So understanding those nuances and what you plan to do with that land, super important. And just something else to consider is that, if you've got a little bit of a budget, and you buy something that's a little bit more rolling or has some steep places to it, and you're like, oh, well, I'll just build like a daylight basement or something like that, just know your excavation and building costs are going to be significantly increased because of that. Excavation and earth moving is very expensive, and then just getting in and out of the property is another cost that you have to look at.
Okay, another really important thing to be aware of is financing. It's not that easy to just go to your banker and get financing for acreage properties, whether it's raw land or a property that has a house with acreage on it. Now, why is that? Because it depends on what it is you're buying. If you're buying raw land, you want to be aware that most banks aren't going to loan on it. In fact, there's only a couple of banks here locally that will give you a loan for raw land. And you're going to pay more money in interest rates and have to put a significantly much more money down because it's a higher risk for the bank. And if you don't plan on building on it for a while, then they're probably going to make sure that they're securing the asset they're about to loan money on. Now, if you plan on building right away, then you'd want to look into maybe like a construction permanent loan, which you can get a little better deal interest rate wise on those. But again, you got to be aware of what those kind of loans are going to require in order for you to do it. Now, if you're buying a piece of property, and this is huge because we've run into this a lot, where somebody's like, hey, I found 40 acres with a really nice manufactured home on it, and there's like a lavender farm on it or whatever, right? Like somebody's just excited. The thing we have to be aware of is what?
Well, the structures need to make up about minimally 50% of the value of what's being asked. And
this is important.
And if the bank's not seeing that, if they're not seeing value in the structures, mainly the home, then they're not going to finance it. It doesn't make a smart investment for them. And this is, we run into this a lot in Oregon in the sense that you get maybe some not so nice properties, either home or manufactured, on these big parcels of land, and they're asking big money for it. And that usually means that you're bringing in cash, or you're going through like an ag loan.
Yeah.
And
an ag loan is an agricultural loan, by the way. And
Yeah.
that's a special type of bank.
And the issue with that, just like with the construction loan or the bare land loan, is that you're going to pay a higher interest rate. There's just, you're not getting that premium residential.
It's that ratio
financing.
between land and
Yep.
the value of the actual property. And of
Yep.
course, the manufactured home is looked at as a lesser type of structure
Very much.
than a custom build or a home on the property. And you could still run into that a little bit with a home, because
Some of the derelict homes, or
Yeah.
some of the smaller, you find a lot of very small homes on large pieces of land, and you're going to run into the same situation.
Yeah.
So
getting that financing in place ahead of time,
Yeah.
and knowing what options you have, because Erica here sells a lot of horse type properties or whatever, and those also come with their own little caveats.
They certainly do. I mean, if you're looking at like a nice 4 stall barn, maybe even up to an 8 stall barn, that's one thing. But when you start looking at some of these larger 20 stall barn entities, your financing starts looking a little different. That's not your typical residential buy. And especially when so much of the value is being placed in the outbuildings, is there an arena? Is there a covered arena? Is there additional shops and whatnot that are garnering a lot of that cost? And so really understanding like how you're financing that, what is your lender, sometimes lender portfolios don't allow for larger acreage, I've run into a lot of situations where the lender is like, we will take, we can finance like 5 acres
that's
and
really
a nice
common.
house. And you're like, oh, okay. So making sure that
conventional type financing.
Yeah. So making sure that, what your lender's portfolio allows them to do. And then having an understanding, if that's not, your 40-acre dream, then getting that specific type of financing in place before you move forward to make sure it's going to be in your budget.
And if you have questions on that or need a good lender recommendation, that's what we're here for, so reach out. Okay, the next topic we're going to talk about is you really want to stutter. You want to study the title reports a lot more
Super
intentionally, because there's what on the title reports that can show up.
Easements. And easements are big with acreage properties because it could dramatically affect how you're using your land, what you can put where. I've seen properties where, they were split front to back, and, the property behind has easements on both sides. And maybe only one easement is being used currently, but you can't block that second easement. It's still there. And not to mention, it may for you affect, the value of that land to you.
Yeah.
If you're losing 50 feet on either side of your land, or, a lot of times we also see utility easements. And what does that look like? Because you can't say no to easements. I mean, they're just attached to the property.
Or where you build on the property based
where
on
you
those
build,
easements.
and then who has access to your property.
Yes,
You
and
know,
that's common, right? Like we see a
Super
lot of
common.
acreage where back in 1974, the previous owners agreed to put in a driveway easement or accessibility so the guy could get to the back of his property from your property,
Yep.
or shared wells or not shared wells, like all that stuff has to be studied, understood, so you know what you're buying and getting into.
And you may think that just because it's not there when you buy the property, well, maybe it's a vacant piece of land that's sitting behind you, and whoever buys that, if it's sold at some point, they can come in and they can have right to that, to being able to access their property. So it's just really good, again, to know, is there something that's been attached to the property in terms of an easement? Is there a well agreement that should or is attached to, the property? Maybe your septic system runs through your neighbor's property, or maybe your neighbor's runs through your property. You got to be careful of, you can't just go and build something on top of that. Those easements, they are attached to the property. You can't undo them. So just know when you buy a piece of property, even if it's already got an existing house and stuff on it, that there could be things like that affect its true value.
All right, so the next point we want to talk about is, why are some acreage properties, like a 5-acre or less parcel, the same price as a larger acreage up to 20 or 40 acres? And what do you think the reason is for that, Erica?
Desirability.
Yes.
It is a lot easier and more desirable for people to have, I'll say 5 acres and under with a nice house. It's like the quintessential homestead per se. And because of that desirability and almost, I think sometimes the ability to keep it looking more pristine, more park-like, more, dream-like, it does have a higher value. I mean, you know, when you start getting above 5 acres, it's almost inconsequential sometimes. Is it 5 acres? Is it 10 acres? Is it 15 acres? You know, unless you're specifically needing an amount of space, but you're not going to always see a dramatic, you know, like, well, this one was 12 acres and this one was 15 acres, and there wasn't, you know, a price per acre difference in those two properties. It's going to start coming down to, you know, location and outbuildings and quality of the house at that point.
And what can you do with the acreage? I mean, one thing we notice is there's really 2 types of acreage buyers out here. And this is being a little general, but there's either the people that want a smaller acreage parcel, but they want a really nice house, or they want to be further out in the country.
They don't want to see their neighbors per se. They don't want their neighbors right on top of them.
They don't want the suburban life. They don't mind working on maybe getting on a riding lawnmower, or maybe they have a shop or something like that. And then you have the other acreage buyers that like they need more acreage because they have animals, or they want to produce agriculture, or they want to do farm to what do they call it, forest deferral. They want to have a tree farm. So it's like, and again, I'm being a little broad in those two because, you know, you could break them down and there's more to it than that. But essentially what we see is 2 types of acreage buyers, which is the kind that want just like a manageable amount of acreage, but they're not looking to produce any income or, you know, do anything, you know, elaborate with the property.
They don't need it for pets or anything like that. They just they want space for themselves.
They don't want anybody telling them what to do. They want to have as many cars in the driveway or trucks or RVs.
Or maybe that's, you know, part of it. They've got a lot of, you know, like business vehicles that they need to park there, and they need that space.
Yeah, and then some people just, once you live in the country, it is really tough to go back to living in the city. And we find that a lot of people who come from country properties, like even though they might want to size down their acreage, they still want a smaller footprint in the acreage department because it's just really tough to go from that to a suburban life.
It really is, in the sense, you know, that when you're used to not having people super close to you, I mean, even if you can still see them, when you don't have people right on top of you, that is a tough one to change. And, you know, that's really just, I mean, if you think back to probably when a lot of, you know, people were growing up, that's how it was. We didn't have this high density lifestyle that we have now. And so they want to get back to that. You know, it's like, I even say anything like half acre plus, man, half acre to 5 acres is so desirable by so many people. And we hear it time and time again where they're like, I just want like a half acre and a 1-level house. And, you know, they're hard to find here.
And they're hard to find because if you go outside of the urban growth boundary, it's usually a 5 acre minimum to build. So you can't just go out and like siphon off a half acre or 1 acre off of a piece of land. A lot of those properties that are smaller acreage parcels were kind of grandfathered in decades ago to being smaller acreage parcels. So when they come up, they're highly, highly sought after. And more demand is happening for people to move out and have that kind of land. So again, it's also very expensive. I mean, people don't realize that just to have a piece of land in, you know, outside the urban growth boundary, or have an acre property or more, can really be more expensive than you probably bargained for, just because it's high demand. It's harder to find those, and more and more people are trying to get to that point, especially if they've been in density housing, or, you know, they really want to, you know, be able to do what they want to do with their property. So
I mean, you can find the occasional, I would say, for like, you know, less than 600, but you're far out. You're not anywhere close to the metros. And then, you know, realistically, if you want to be within, I would say 30, 45 minutes of the city, you're probably minimally looking at about $750. You know, and that's just to have a, you know, nice average size home and some space.
All right, and because you stuck around to the end, we're going to share with you our secret tip on buying acreage property, and that is, when the power goes out, what do you do?
Well, you're on your own. It's really important that you should probably think about having a generator. Either a portable or a whole home installed generator. And, you know, part of that is, especially if you're an acreage property that is on, you know, a well and septic.
You can't use your well if the power goes out.
You can't use your well if the power goes out. So, you know, you need something minimally that will run your well, allow you to, you know, flush toilets, all that good stuff. You know, if you have animals, you're going to need that well.
Well, in some areas of acreage, you know, like depending on the winter months, you know, we have some pretty decent storms that come in. And there's oftentimes people that will be without power for a week or so. And so if you are not somebody that can deal with that, buy a generator ahead of time or understand that you might have to make provisions when that happens.
Yeah, it's really important, and this is kind of, one of those things where we get asked a lot, like, oh, is it really windy over there, or is it, and there are areas that have more severe wind than other areas, or, you're closer to the mountains, you might get a little bit of snow. In Oregon,
out, like in the coastal range up near Bald Peak and stuff, it can be like snowing there and no snow closer into town.
We're very sensitive in our altitude, what gets snow, what doesn't get snow, and it doesn't take much here.
Doesn't take much.
So, I've literally left a house on the hill and gone to the bottom, and snow at the top, nothing at the bottom.
Yep.
And it really does we have microclimates here. So knowing what your microclimate is, knowing what your concerns are. Do you have a lot of trees on your property? Do you need to maintain those trees to make sure that they're not coming down on your power lines?
One thing that comes to mind is a house we sold a few years back that was out further, and when it snowed down in Portland, it was no big deal, right? But this house was closing, and I remember we closed escrow, and the seller couldn't get out of their house. They had a long driveway. It was totally snow-packed where they were. They were out on Acreage, and I think it was a revelation for the buyer because that was the week they were supposed to move in as well, and the seller couldn't get out for 4 or 5 days.
Yeah.
And so, it's one of those where, that was...
I'll throw another little bonus one in to think about, and that's kind of accessibility. So, like, if you're planning to like haul trailers up and down your driveway, or if you're planning to have larger vehicles, or maybe you only have a city type car, like your traditional sedan, and you've got a really steep gravel road for your access, that's something to think about, because you're going to be driving that road a lot, and just conditionally you're going to be taking care of it. So when you get to Acreage properties, you're no longer under under the counties. Yeah, you're no longer under county maintenance a lot of times. Right. So you got to figure out who's going to keep that road in good condition. So yeah, just make sure you have a generator, because there's always some point in the year, whether it's wind, snow, ice, that you're going to need that, and you need it for your systems on the home. And then can you get to your house?
Hey, thanks for joining us on today's video all about the tips in terms of buying acreage, so you could have some of those maybe on your property. We love what we do, so if you guys are at all interested in moving to the Portland area, and if you're looking to buy acreage, we have a lot more we can share with you, help you identify areas of town that might fit what you're looking for, and we'll see you on the next video.